involves a black glove found in the backyard and investigators traveling all the way to the rough and tumble oil towns of North Dakota.
They grabbed the handle. And I walked up. And I hit him back in the head. And he stumbled and fell.
Hey everybody, welcome back to an all-new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise. I hope you guys are having a good start to your day, wherever you're doing, wherever you are. I hope you're ready to listen to this case. It's definitely a wild one and kind of a cluster, if I'm going to be honest, so you're going to be wanting to pay attention. It's got some weird twists along the way, but let me start by saying this. They say that money is the root of all evil, right? Now, it obviously doesn't mean that you're a bad person if you want more money, because there's nothing wrong with wanting security, wanting to make sure that you have enough food to feed your family, that you have a roof over your head, things like that. You're also not hurting anybody if you are making money and earning money. Nothing wrong with it. So I don't think that money is the root of all evil, or even most of it. But obviously, we do know that sometimes evil things have been done for money, in exchange for money or to obtain money. And people who become violent and dangerous because of greed, who just want an easy cash out, an easy payout. And I think that today's case really does drive that idea home. So today's case is the story of Doug Carlisle. And guys, let's jump right in. Okay, so the holidays are literally going to be here before we know it. And if you're like me, I feel like I have a pattern of wanting to give the best Christmas, best everything to my kids, my family, and buy the gifts and the presents. And then come first of the year, I'm always like, how am I going to pay all of this off? I put all this on a credit card. What am I going to do? And debt is something that, look, I'll be honest, I have struggled with in my life personally from time to time, and I know a lot of people do. And today's episode is sponsored by PDS Debt, and I want to talk with you about them because I wish I knew about them sooner. PDS Debt has customized options for anybody struggling with credit cards, with personal loans, with collections, or even maybe medical bills. And so if it feels like you're making these payments every month on your debt and your balances just aren't going down, PDS has solutions for you. Everyone with over $10,000 or more in eligible debt qualifies, and there's no minimum credit score required. Bad and fair credit are accepted. So you can save more while paying off your debt in a fraction of the time using PDS Debt, because PDS cares about helping you get out of debt. PDS Debt strives to understand your specific scenario, and they can provide alternative solutions to becoming debt-free. PDS Debt has customized options for anybody who is struggling with whatever it is: credit cards, personal loans, collections, medical bills. So start planning today. Get a free debt analysis right now at pdsdebt.com/10tolife. It only takes 30 seconds. That's pdsdebt.com/10tolife. pdsdebt.com/10tolife. In 2013, 63-year-old Doug Carlisle could have been the perfect poster boy for what was considered the American dream, or what has long been considered the American dream. He was only 16 years old when he met a woman named Alberta. I mean, he was young, but he came from a culture and a background where it was kind of just expected that you get married right away. As soon as you're an adult, and then you have kids, you do all of the things. Because when he was 16, it was the 60s after all. That's just what you did. That's kind of how things went. And it's what he did as well. So only 2 weeks after he graduated from high school, Doug and Alberta were married. None of their friends or family members thought that it was weird for them to get married that young. I mean, these days we see some 18-year-olds and wonder how they could even survive going to the grocery store without their parents, let alone actually get married and work on starting a family of their own. But sometimes it happens. But that's what Doug and Alberta did. They had kids, and they eventually got to have a very large family, which they raised in Spokane, Washington. Now, Spokane is about 4 hours east of Seattle, and by no means is it a small town. It is definitely a growing city with a very rich history and plenty to do. Still, though, it's generally considered a pretty safe and quiet place to raise a family. So by 2013, Doug and Alberta, they had been married for 42 years. They also had 6 children together. All of their kids were now grown and they were married. So when you count the spouses, that made 12 people in total with 20 grandchildren. I mean, we're talking a humongous family. I personally can't even imagine Thanksgiving or Christmas, what that must be like. I am just looking and imagining chaos completely. Maybe not controlled chaos, but chaos for sure. I don't know. I just feel like that is a lot of people to have running around to have at any given time. Happy memories, but chaotic, at least for me. That'd be overwhelming. Now, anyways, earlier I said how Doug was living the American dream and that a big, happy family is one part of that, right? There's also the expectation that you make something of yourself in order to have the American dream. And Doug was very accomplished. He was a very successful businessman, and he and Alberta were, I don't want to say extremely wealthy, but they were more than well off. I mean, like many businessmen, Doug had dabbled in a lot of different business ventures in his life. The majority of his business dealings had always been in trucking, in construction, things like that, but they did very, very well for themselves. Now, the last thing I want to mention about Doug is that he and Alberta were devout Christians, and they raised their kids to go to church, to read the Bible, to take all of those things just very, very seriously. They were a family who always got up and went to a service on Sunday morning, and they prayed before every meal. I mean, God and family always came first. Now, Doug was apparently known for a lot of different things. It kind of just depended on who exactly you were asking. If you were to ask one of his fellow church members, they would have told you that he was, this great, honest Christian man who was extremely devoted to his wife, a very doting father. And then if you would ask people who knew him more on the business side of things, they would have told you, yeah, Doug's a great guy. He always keeps things professional. He never cusses. He cares about people. He cares about appearances. Maybe even cares about appearances a little too much, if I'll say that. I mean, the point is everybody had a different point of view, and nobody is right 100% of the time. So even though Doug had a lot of successes at work, he also did have some failures. And I don't think anyone likes dwelling on their mistakes, and nobody's going to go out and, brag about a time that they screwed up, especially at work. But Doug definitely tried his hardest to sweep any of those mistakes right under the rug. He kind of pretended that they never even happened. And let me just give you an example. Back in 1999, it was a very rough year for Doug. None of it was random, though. The chaos had all been from consequences of his own actions. And those actions didn't exactly match up with that description that I mentioned a few minutes ago about his church members and how they would describe him. See, in 1999, Washington State's Department of Labor secured around $100,000 in judgments against him. And judgment is just kind of like, a fancy legal way to say that it was a result of a lawsuit in court. So kind of like a fine or restitution, something like that. Now, I don't know exactly what those judgments were for, but anything concerning the Department of Labor, pretty much in simple terms, means that he was not being honest. He also probably wasn't treating his employees with fairness or giving them the rights that they legally deserved under the law. I mean, some messy stuff. So, not exactly a successful time in his business that he would be bragging about, right? So after this, he ended up filing for bankruptcy. And I know that $100,000 is a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely interesting that this prominent businessman would be totally bankrupt by just $100,000. I feel like most companies, if they're doing healthy or well at all, would need a much bigger fine to completely tank them. But I don't know. Who knows? I could be wrong. But this whole bankruptcy situation didn't stop him from trying out new things in the business world afterward. To Doug, this was all just part of the process. And so his next big goal was to get into housing, and it was to find people to rent some of his property. But it was going to take some time because it's not like you can just wake up one day and do something like that from scratch. You have to build it. So it took a little over 2 years for him to really get the ball rolling. And when his plan was finally approved, that's when the recession hit. So his new business idea, the one that he had spent so much time building, as you can imagine, it kind of just pretty much went in the toilet. It was like one thing after another for Doug until finally he decided he needed to switch gears. The rumor around town was that Doug was now getting into the oil industry. He needed more money to make the transition, though, and to get this new business started. So Doug was now out meeting a ton of different wealthy people, making friends, brushing shoulders with like the super wealthy and people who were loaded and trying to get things going. The dates are a little bit fuzzy, but somewhere between late 2011 and early 2012, Doug met a man named James Henriksen. This thanks to an introduction from a mutual acquaintance. Now, James wasn't originally a local. At 22, he had moved to Washington to work as a mason contractor, and he had just stayed a local ever since. He still, though, had a home in North Dakota, and he just kind of went back and forth between the two of them. Even though he hadn't grown up in Spokane, he didn't have a hard time meeting new people and making friends in both the business world and in his personal world. And like Doug, he was very successful in many ways, and he worked on pretty big commercial projects. He really just came across as a good, successful guy. But only if you were looking from the outside in. Because anyone who actually knew him knew that he was pretty much a complete sleazeball, both personally and professionally. In his personal life, James was no saint. He had a long history of getting into legal trouble. By the time that he was 35 years old and met Doug, he had been convicted of theft, burglary, attempted assault, attempting to elude police, and even illegally growing marijuana. I mean, the man was busy, to say the least. And keep in mind, those charges were all from after he moved to Washington. It's not like he had a troubled past in his teenage years, but grew up and then got himself back on the straight and narrow. He was actively still doing all of these things, and he was scamming the people who worked for him. So James was pretty much kind of just like a crappy guy about every single way possible. One person who worked with him for a while described him as being somebody who lied to people's faces and then would cover it up with a smile, and could do it so convincingly that people believed it. So again, master manipulator. Which, as awful as that is to say, it probably did make him an even better businessman. So I mentioned that he and Doug met through a mutual contact, somebody that they had both done business with. Eventually, James ended up screwing that mutual contact over, though. They created a trucking company together, and then James just totally ripped him off. He only ever liked having a business partner when it was convenient or when he had bills to pay, but when it came to the profit, he just wanted that all for himself. I mean, just shady through and through. But in spite of all of that, for whatever reason, Doug and James clicked. Maybe James was just so good at being charming that Doug didn't see just how truly sketchy he was. Or maybe Doug wasn't the most upstanding guy and he wanted to be more like James. I don't really know. But I do know that they became business partners, and they were very determined to make their way to the top. The two decided to go forward with not one, but two businesses. Their first was in something that they were both familiar and comfortable with. They started a trucking company together called Bridgewater Energy. And for their second gig, they wanted to get more into the oil industry, like I mentioned earlier. Doug had been interested in that even before. So they decided to open up an oil field development firm. It was called Kingdom Dynamics Enterprises, and they had their eye on 640 acres of land on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation. The main issue was, though, this property was going to cost them $2 million. And if you remember, Doug literally filed for bankruptcy for just over $100,000. So it's not like he had, a cool $2 million just sitting around waiting to be invested into some sort of property. So James and his wife Sarah said that they could cover about a third of the costs, namely $640,000. And somehow Doug convinced another one of his friends to pitch in almost $1 million. I guess as an investor, it seemed like a good idea, but they were still short about $360,000 or so. And Doug still hadn't pitched in anything personally, nothing at all. Maybe because he didn't have the cash, maybe because he didn't want to, I don't really know. But that final $360,000 never came in. Doug didn't chip in, James didn't give any more, and they didn't manage to track down any other investors. So since the two of them couldn't buy all the property that they wanted, they ended up getting only half of it, and then they planned to snag up the rest of it once they had the money for it. Now, so far that sounds pretty normal business stuff, right? You chip in money, you find investors, you buy what you can, you try to buy more in the future. But behind the scenes, beginning in around 2013, there was a lot of tension at Kingdom Dynamics. I mean, tension to say the least. Somehow James learned that Doug had actively been planning to buy him out of the company, and he was more than pissed. Which was pretty hypocritical on his part, I have to say, because James was planning to do the exact same thing. He had been working behind the scenes to buy Doug out of his share altogether, so both of them just kind of in secret working against each other. Apparently, James's reason for wanting Doug out of the deal was because he had learned some pretty insane information and he didn't want to share it. See, a piece of property near theirs was bringing in a profit of around $240,000 per day. Not a week, not a month, a single day, almost 250 grand. So James wanted Doug out because he didn't want to share those profits. He wanted that 240 a day all to himself. And at one point, James offered Doug a deal where if he stepped down, he would still be able to keep collecting a percentage of those profits. But Doug refused. He knew how much money he could potentially be making, and he knew that the deal that James was offering him was not actually a good one. He would make way more money if he stuck with the company. So at this point, things were at a pretty awkward standstill. Neither one of them wanted the other one involved in the business, and neither one of them was willing to take one for the team and just leave, so it was definitely tense. It was all about to boil over too, and since these guys were in business together, there was no way for either one of them to get away from the other one. But all of that changed on December 15th, 2013. It was around 7 p.m., and Doug and Alberta were just getting home from church. I guess they had gone to an evening service. And what happened next was like something out of a horror movie. Alberta went inside through the back door, just like she did every single day, all the time. Doug was still outside, closing the iron gate on their driveway. So while Alberta went inside, she set down her purse, took off her coat, all the little routine things that you do. By the time Doug had made it inside, Alberta was already upstairs. And that's where she was when she heard what sounded like multiple people speaking in the kitchen. And that was confusing to her because nobody should have been home except for her and Doug. They hadn't been planning on having any visitors over, and it clearly sounded like 2 or more people were in the kitchen, not like Doug had turned on the radio or the TV or was having a phone call on speakerphone. So she headed downstairs just to see what was going on. But she only made it halfway down the staircase before she saw Doug in the kitchen. And across from him was a man in a face mask. He was dressed completely in black. He also had a gun pointed directly at Doug. Now, as soon as Alberta saw that, she immediately turned and ran right back upstairs. By the time she made it to the top step, she heard 5 or 6 loud popping sounds behind her in the kitchen. There was no question in her mind. She knew that she had heard gunshots. So she ran into the bedroom, she hid in the closet, and she called 911.
There's been shot. A man just taken our house and shot my husband, I think. If he hears me, he's going to shoot me.
When the police arrived at the scene, the shooter was long gone, and unfortunately, so was Doug. I mean, physically, of course, he was there, but he was gone. He was dead. Doug was 63 years old, and he had been murdered in cold blood in his own home. Just an hour before, he had been at church, thanking God for everything that was positive in his life. And now, he didn't even have a life to be thankful for anymore. Now, right away, one thing was extremely clear to the police. This was no random attack. It all seemed too planned, too perfect. Whoever the murderer was, they had been sitting around and waiting for Doug and Alberta to get back from church. They knew their schedule. They knew when they would be gone. They knew when they would be coming home. It's not like they just showed up and broke into the house whenever. They made sure that they would be sitting and waiting. Nothing was missing from the house either, so clearly this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. And of course, there was the fact that Alberta hadn't been hurt. And I mean, think about it. Alberta got into the house first. So if she had interrupted a robbery in progress, you would think that she would have gotten shot. But instead, this home intruder, whoever they were, waited for her to get inside, get comfortable, go upstairs, and then they confronted Doug when he was alone. I would think that if you were going to commit a murder, you would want to get rid of any possible witnesses. And if this person had left Alberta alive intentionally, it was possible that maybe the killer knew her personally. Maybe they felt bad for her, maybe they liked her, maybe they loved her, maybe they didn't want to hurt her. Or, if this was some kind of professional hit situation, the shooter might have been thinking that they had to kill Doug. That was the job. Nobody else was supposed to get hurt, and they weren't going to hurt anyone else. Either way, clearly Doug was the target. And given all of the tension at Doug's work, it was worth wondering if he had been killed for business reasons. So the detectives started out by wanting to talk to his employees, his coworkers, his investors, all the people who had anything to do with his company. And interestingly enough, the investigators didn't have to look very far, because Doug's family pointed them directly toward his business partner, James. Now, this is nuts, but they weren't just going off of a hunch. Apparently, in the weeks leading up to his murder, Doug had literally told his family that if anything were to happen to him, that James was probably the one who was behind it. He even borrowed a gun from one of his sons and said, "If I disappear or if I wake up with bullets in my back, promise me that you will let everyone know that James Henriksen did it." I mean, that's not subtle at all. That is pretty clear. And anytime we've heard in cases where somebody's like, "Hey, if I end up dead, look at so-and-so," more times than not, it usually pans out that way, right? Emphasis on more times than not. Is that what's going to be the case here? On top of all of that, his family knew things weren't going the greatest with the new businesses and business partner. However, I don't think that they had any idea before the murder that things were this bad. I mean, it's one thing for someone to have issues at work, but then to start telling people, "If I get killed, this is who did it," and then to literally get murdered right after you say that, I mean, this was insane. So after hearing all of this, the investigators made sure to get in contact with James. The problem was, for whatever reason, they couldn't get him to sit down face to face and do an interrogation. The best that they could do was get him to hop on a phone call with them. And during this call, James didn't even try to act like he was all that upset about his partner's death. Not only that, but he made it clear that he really didn't like Doug and he wasn't happy with him. He even told the investigators that he was angry at Doug. And when they asked why, he said, "It's because Doug is very good at not paying people what he owes them." Apparently, according to James, Doug owed him $1.8 million. Now, I don't know exactly where those numbers came from, but that's just what he told the detectives. Maybe he had run up a big tab at the trucking business or the oil business, or both of them, I don't really know. But even after he pretty much whined about how terrible their business partnership was going and dragged Doug's name through the dirt, James said that he had absolutely nothing to do with his murder. He claimed he didn't know anything about it, and more specifically, he didn't do it. He also added in, "Look, I have an alibi. I was in North Dakota when Doug got shot." And this phone call happened just 3 hours after the murder, so it's not like he had a lot of time to flee the state if he did do it. His alibi was pretty solid, assuming he was telling the truth. So sure enough, when the detectives checked into James's location data, he was in North Dakota. And remember, this crime took place in Washington state. And going for just a quick little Google search here, I'm going to say it's pretty impossible to go from Washington to North Dakota in under 3 hours. However, even though he had technically this solid alibi, all this proved was that James didn't pull the trigger himself. He was still rich after all, so could he have hired somebody to do his dirty work? Crazier things have happened. So if James did hire someone, the next question was, would it have been someone he knew and trusted? Or would it be somebody completely random? Either one seemed equally possible, but the investigators started by looking into James's friends and all of the people he knew. They wanted to see if they could spot any big red flags. And boy, did they ever. Now, I'm sure you heard the saying, birds of a feather flock together, right? Well, this couldn't be more true in this case. Because James was this con artist, sketchy type of guy, so it's not like he surrounded himself with truly amazing people, right? And let's just be honest, even if he did, what would they really have in common? What would they talk about? And just as suspected, all of his friends were on the same level as him. Lots of them had prison records, lots of them had shady pasts, but the problem was that he had so many sketchy guys in his corner that it was going to take a minute for them to suss every single one of them out. So the police started off with a guy who was apparently known to be James's right-hand man. His name was Robert Delio. Now, along with some drug charges, Robert also had a manslaughter charge in his, very colorful criminal history, to say the least. I'm guessing it must have been from a ways back and he had already served his time, which is why he was out, but he definitely had a checkered past. Now, a lot of the arrests had also been in Spokane, but he wasn't living there at the time of Doug's murder. Luckily for detectives, though, he did have a girlfriend and a child in Spokane, and he came to town to visit them just 2 days after Doug's murder. So since he was around, the investigators brought him in for an interview. And as soon as he knew why he was there, he immediately denied that he was involved in any way. He told them, "I don't do that kind of thing anymore. I'm just trying to work a regular job. I had nothing to do with it. Don't look at me." And it might sound like a load of bull, but besides denying everything, he was actually pretty cooperative. He agreed to take a polygraph test, he passed it with flying colors, and between his interview, his alibi of being out of town, and the polygraph, the police kind of sort of just moved on from him. They didn't think that he was the one who pulled the trigger or who had ordered the trigger to be pulled. That was their main focus at this point, who pulled the trigger or who made the order. Now, the good news is that while they had been questioning Robert, he did give the police some very helpful information. Specifically, he casually dropped the name of a guy named Todd Bates. And I know I'm throwing a lot of names out there, guys, but bear with me. It'll all make sense in the end. So during this conversation, Robert just mentioned Todd's name. It wasn't like he spilled any huge tea or anything, but the detectives definitely made a note of it, because it wasn't the first time that they had heard this man's name. An anonymous informant had actually reached out to the detectives about Todd before. They said that Robert and Todd had worked together on multiple occasions, which, okay, that's not too big of a deal, but it's worth knowing just in case. But they also said that Tom was what they described as being James's enforcer. According to the informant, there were a lot of times when James told Todd to beat people up or go and intimidate them, be the muscle. And I'm not just talking like people who got in too deep. He would do this if James just didn't like them or wanted them out of his way. Again, allegedly, according to this anonymous tipster. And on top of all of that, this anonymous person also said that they had seen James talking to Todd and had even overheard James say, quote, "This job will be paid the same as the last one." Now, first of all, so far as tips go, this one's not the most convincing in my book. I mean, we are supposed to believe James and Todd were just planning a murder out in the open and this person could overhear everything. We also don't even know if they were talking about killing people. They were business partners after all, so James could have just been paying Todd for any perfectly normal, boring legal thing. Who knows? But the reason that this all came together as being sketchy was because apparently the informant told the investigators that they believed that the first job James was talking about when he said this job will be paid as the same as, the last one, had to do with James's operations manager, Casey Clark. See, he went missing under suspicious circumstances back in February of 2012, not too long before Doug's murder. So the informant was saying when James said, hey, this job will be paid the same as the last one, what he really meant was something like, kill Doug like how you killed Casey, and I'll pay you for it just like I paid you for that one. Now granted, this was all a lot of guesswork and speculation. But it was also pretty weird that in the course of just 1 year, one of James' employees went missing and was never found, and then his business partner was brutally murdered in his own home. Pretty big coincidence, assuming it was actually a coincidence. Obviously, it wasn't enough to move on or make an arrest or anything like that, but the police were looking into everything, gathering all of the evidence together, trying to get to a point where they could close in on who the killer was. Christmas went by, New Year's went by, and then finally, on January 14th, 2014, they were ready to nail James. They had a search warrant for the home that James and Sarah owned back in North Dakota. The hope was that they might find either guns or evidence that James was involved with fraud. Even if they didn't come across anything that directly linked James to Doug's murder, the police knew that he was a felon, so they might be able to tie him to another crime and lock him up while they finished the murder investigation. And their strategy paid off. Inside the house, they found a huge 5-foot gun safe in the master bedroom. And inside the safe, they found 4 pistols, 2 shotguns, and an assault rifle, all of which were totally illegal for James to have because he was a convicted felon. So they pretty much hit the jackpot, and they arrested James right away. And if you think that was a pretty successful workday because of the guns and James' arrest, they also managed to get another person into cuffs that day. A 50-year-old man named Timothy Sukow. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Which you're probably wondering, okay, Annie, well, who is this guy? Who is Timothy Sukow? Well, the investigators had some evidence that they hadn't talked about publicly yet. They were still keeping all of it under wraps until they were ready to move forward. And that included something that they found at the scene of Doug's murder. A glove. And it had DNA on it, which matched this guy, Timothy.
Following the homicide that occurred on December 15th, our major crimes detectives searched the scene and recovered a glove. They entered that glove into evidence. DNA was recovered from the glove that matched the suspect, Timothy Sukow.
The DNA evidence wasn't the only thing that got Timothy in trouble. During a search of his work truck, the investigators also found a journal that basically spelled out a handwritten to-do list, but a list for murderers. He had things on there like, quote, practice with pistol, quote, glove, another phrase, quote, wipe tools down. So, he was of course arrested too. Now, looking at this checklist, this to-do list, my first thought was that maybe Timothy was very new to committing crimes. I mean, maybe James had sort of recruited some innocent person to the dark side, so to speak, and that's why he had handwritten notes and was sloppy. But no, not at all. Timothy actually had a long history of multiple assault and burglary charges and convictions. And this is key. He also had connections with Todd, aka James's enforcer. So we have Doug and James, who were business partners. Then we have James' minions, for lack of a better word, and they're all going right down in a line from James's right-hand man, Robert, to his enforcer, Todd, the enforcer, Todd, who knew Timothy, who's the guy whose DNA was at the crime scene on the glove. I mean, the connections kind of just make your head spin. It seems like organized crime, like an organization, right? But everything always goes back to James. And I mean, this case is crazy in a lot of ways, but just the fact that it's like picking through a family tree of violent criminals turned businessmen is so wild to me. So Timothy was now in jail for actually pulling the trigger, and James was in jail for weapons possessions, but he wasn't charged with anything directly related to Doug's murder yet. In fact, it took a while before the police could make any moves again. Months went by before they made an arrest. But this arrest also wasn't James. It was somebody else. It was 33-year-old Robbie Warrer. Now, I know, I'm sorry, more people, more names, it's hard to keep track, and I'm going to keep this very simple and brief. On the night of Doug's murder, a white van was captured on a neighbor's surveillance camera. It belonged to Robbie, and the police figured that he might have been the getaway driver. That was his involvement, but it was enough to get him charged with second-degree murder.
It was going through a series of steps to determine the age of that van, and then doing a series of queries to see who in the state of Washington, the state of Idaho, and other places may have a van like that.
Now, the police didn't only know all of this because of the license and registration and everything, but they also were learning a lot about Robbie because of more anonymous tipsters. Not just one person, but multiple people, all calling in to spill the tea about Robbie, about everything that he was up to. 2 separate informants who came forward were actually friends of Robbie's too. Apparently, Robbie had confided in both of them about being the getaway driver for this crime. He also claimed that when he agreed to be the driver, he thought that Timothy was only going to be breaking Doug's kneecaps, as if that makes it any better and makes his involvement any more understandable. But it seemed like once Robbie actually realized he was part of a murder, he kind of started panicking and freaking out, because that's not what he says he signed up for. Apparently, he never specifically mentioned who actually committed the murder, but by this time, Timothy had already been arrested, so that lack of information wasn't really a big deal. Not to mention that the police were already able to go through Robbie's cell phones and cell records to see that he and Timothy had been texting and calling each other for quite a few hours right before Doug's murder. The records also showed that Robbie's cell phone pinged near Doug's house at the exact time of the shooting. Now, I know this was only 2013, and cell phones and trackers were kind of, new ideas, but they weren't that new. Everybody knew even back then how apps worked, how everything else could track your every move, so I will never understand why murderers bring their phones with them to a crime scene. But I love to see it, I really do. I just love a dumb criminal getting themselves caught, truly. Now, speaking of getting caught, at the time of the murder, Robbie was an 8-time convicted felon. Yeah, 8 times. Just 1 month before Doug's murder, he was arrested for selling meth. His bail was posted, and he was supposed to go to court for it on December 11th, which was 4 days before Doug was murdered, but Robbie didn't show up to court, and obviously they put out a warrant for his arrest. But he was still laying pretty low, which is then obviously how he was still free to go help out with this whole getaway driver gig. And 2 days after Doug's murder, on December 17th, he was then finally arrested due to that warrant that was out for his arrest because of the meth and the court date. But he got out on bail again on Christmas Eve. And guess who posted the bail? Timothy. The shooter had paid to get the getaway driver out of jail. I'm telling you, you can't make this up. And the arrests didn't stop there. The police had more people to find. More dangerous people. In fact, the court documents released after Robbie's arrest specifically read, quote, "There are several outstanding suspects in this case whom law enforcement deem very dangerous. Law enforcement is currently developing information to establish probable cause to arrest additional suspects in this case." Which is so crazy. Like, what in the actual hell is going on here? It literally seems like it's from some bootleg version of The Godfather or something like that. Because right now we have Doug, the man who was murdered, James, who was Doug's business partner and the person who prosecutors believed orchestrated this entire thing, Timothy, the masked man who entered the house and pulled the trigger, and now Robbie, Timothy's getaway driver. And then 3 more arrests came. But don't worry, 2 of these names already came up before. But the first was James's trusted enforcer, good old Todd Bates. It turns out that Todd wasn't just the guy that James would turn to when it came to intimidation tactics. He was also like a criminal personal assistant. So Todd was arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder for hire. And that's because the police believed that when James decided that he wanted Doug out of the picture, he told Todd. And Todd was the one who actually made the phone calls, made the connections, and found all of these other people to commit the actual crime. He also took care of all of the nitty-gritty details like payment, scheduling, things like that. Again, like a criminal personal assistant to James. And I know that's insane to say, but that's really what he did. He did all the admin for him. And remember Robert? He was James's right-hand man, according to everyone. However, he took that polygraph test and he passed. But we all know that polys aren't always foolproof, and this was one of those cases. It turns out that, of course, Todd and Robert were buddies. So when Todd heard that he needed somebody to commit a murder, he went to his friend Robert, to see if he had any good recommendations, which he obviously did. Robert knew Timothy and thought that he would be the perfect fit for a job like this. So he went to Timothy and pretty much said, "Hey, my buddy Todd is looking for someone to murder his boss's business partner. Here's the pay. Here's what needs to be done. You in?" So as much as Robert wanted to act like he had no idea about Doug's murder and wasn't involved in any way, he was lying. He literally was the one that technically ordered the hit, or at the very least had set it all up. So finally, the very last person who was arrested was a man named Lazzaro Pacina. Now, of all of the killers, he probably had the least involvement. Don't get me wrong though, he was no angel either. Apparently, when everything was set up, the plan was for both Timothy and Lazzaro to break into the house and murder Doug. It was never supposed to just be Timothy acting alone. So Robbie drove everyone there, let Timothy and Lazzaro out of the van, and they headed toward the house. But then, for whatever reason, Lazzaro backed out at the very last second. So Lazzaro pretty much just sat outside and never got his hands dirty with any of it. But he was still on the outside, and he still knew the plan, and he never turned on any of his friends, he never turned any information in, nothing. Meaning that he was just as guilty and involved as the rest of them. So that makes 6 different people in total who were arrested and charged in connection with Doug's murder. Somehow, some way, they were all interconnected in this. Well, I guess technically 5, because if you remember, James was arrested for having firearms as a felon. He hadn't been definitively tied to Doug's case yet. But don't worry, his time definitely came. In the end, the investigators were able to charge him with not just 1, but 2 murder for hire charges, as well as 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. And I think I could describe James's downfall in a lot of different ways, but to just make things as simple and straightforward as possible, I'm just going to tell you exactly how the prosecutors believe it all went down. It's hard to say when things exactly started, but like I mentioned earlier, this guy has been committing different crimes for well over a decade. It's not like he was a good guy who just all of a sudden got caught up in a bad situation one day. But for the sake of simplicity and just focusing solely on Doug's murder, I'm going to say that it all started in early 2012. Remember when the first anonymous informant told investigators that they believed that James had something to do with Casey Clark's mysterious disappearance? Well, it turns out they were completely right. One thing about James is that he never would play fair. He never had, and he never would. Anyone who stood in the way of his money or whatever new idea he had, they were an automatic threat. So keep that in mind, and also remember that Casey was the operations manager. So apparently things between them were good until, they weren't, kind of like James and Doug's relationship. Also, just like with Doug, Casey also had seen his death coming. His mother said that in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, he said multiple times that he was scared for his life. Now, I genuinely don't understand how in some of these stories people are like, yeah, my family member said that they were so scared for their life, but we never asked why or who or what happened or anything like that. Like, what? I can't wrap my mind around that. But again, Casey's family just never got all of the details about who he was scared of or why. And that's not to blame them, but if my sister came to me and said, I'm scared for my life, I'm living in fear, and I think I might end up dead, I'd probably say, why do you think that? Who are you scared of? Now, I also want to be very clear. There is nothing out there on KC being a bad guy like James and everybody else that he surrounded himself with. So I don't want the perception to automatically be that, he was this terrible guy and he rolled with the wrong crowd and that's why it happened, because there's nothing out there that really even indicates that. As a matter of fact, KC actually changed a lot once he started hanging around James. It sounds to me like he was probably a pretty laid-back, normal guy, but then once James came into the picture, he started keeping a gun with him, he started acting different, maybe he knew he wasn't in a safe company anymore, or maybe he was getting more into that lifestyle. I don't really know, we may never really know the truth. But it's believed that James discovered that KC had plans of branching out and creating his own trucking company. He was not only planning on becoming a competitor, but apparently it looked like he was planning on poaching some of James's employees. So of course, this changed KC from being a friend to a threat, which meant James needed to get rid of him. So James talked Timothy into killing KC for the price of $20,000. It was going to be paid in 2 separate $10,000 payments, and the plan was set. James lured KC into his North Dakota trucking shop, all while Timothy was waiting in the dark. Then James pointed something out to KC, kind of distracting him, and then Timothy ran up behind KC and hit him 4 times with a lead pipe on the back of the head.
I didn't even think. It's just, I grabbed the handle. And I walked up. I knew. And I hit him back in the head. And he stumbled and fell. I hate telling this story. It sucks. And he tried to get up. And I get him up 3, 4 more times. He stopped moving. I could tell the last hit was so solid.
Then they cleaned up the bloody mess and disposed of Casey's body in the Badlands State Park in South Dakota, and to this day, his remains have never been found. For a while, Timothy really thought that he got away with his murder. It really seemed like nobody and no police ever suspected him. But he also knew that that could change any second. Apparently, all along, Casey's family thought that James had something to do with the disappearance. It was just like Doug's family after his murder. They were going to the police and they were saying, hey, you need to look into James. He's so suspicious. He's shady. But for whatever reason, the police just didn't take Casey's relatives as seriously. His family was so confident about James's involvement that they even started their own Facebook page to talk about all of the evidence against James and to raise awareness for Casey's case. That page ran a whole campaign against James too. They were absolutely onto him, and they did such a good job making him look suspicious that he actually started losing business. People weren't wanting to work with him anymore, which I don't blame them. I think that's fair. I wouldn't want to work with someone who was accused of straight up killing one of their employees. Certainly not. Both James and his wife actually ended up filing a defamation lawsuit against Casey's mom in October of 2012 because of all of this. I'm not sure how this lawsuit ended, but the main point is that James was under a lot of stress around this time. Obviously, it was all from his own actions, but it's important to note his mindset leading into Doug's murder. And it didn't help the case that by the following summer, a whole bunch of different government agencies, including the IRS and Homeland Security, were now investigating James and his wife for wire fraud, also for mail fraud, for money laundering. I mean, it was bad all the way around. And then James went into his business with Doug, and by this time he was really desperate for some kind of win. He actually traveled to one of Doug's son's offices and even threatened him. He basically said if he didn't cough up the extra $400,000 that they needed in order to buy that land that they wanted, then something bad was going to happen to him and to his family.
This really centers around a burgeoning oil industry in North Dakota, and the acquisition of property and other assets and sales, and whether property was really valued properly. There were some significant financial issues that arose during those transactions, and as the affidavit speaks about, we believe that it is very possible that the homicide was a result of those business transactions that went bad.
Obviously, James didn't get the money that he asked for, the threats didn't work, and they didn't buy the land. So then he began planning to kill Doug. And from there, we know how everybody else got to be involved. Thankfully, everyone either pled guilty or was found guilty of their various charges. Timothy was sentenced to 30 years, Robert was sentenced to 22 years, Robbie 10 years, Lazaro 12 years, and Todd 8. Last but not least, though, was James, the person ultimately responsible for both Casey and Doug's murders. And James was definitely not taking any plea deals. He fought back with his fancy lawyers, tooth and nail. But in the end, all of his money was not enough to save him. And really, what put him behind bars was the testimony of the people who had once been the closest to him. And his wife, Sarah, actually his ex-wife by the time the trial was around, was one of those people. And her testimony probably didn't come from a place of wanting to get justice for Casey and Doug's family. In fact, she was in rough waters herself because she had been implicated in an embezzlement scheme with James. But she cooperated with the prosecutors, and she agreed to testify against James in exchange for just 3 years of supervised probation. And as it turns out, James had also been cheating on his wife, and that woman testified against him too. So did Timothy, and he brought all of the juicy, gory details. He laid out just how badly James had wanted Doug and Casey dead. He testified that when it came to both murders, he was always hesitant and tried to talk James into just roughing them up or beating them up instead. But James wasn't having it. He said he wouldn't be happy until his enemies were cold, in the ground, and dead. Shockingly, Timothy was the only one out of the entire group who really showed any type of remorse. At his sentencing, he actually sobbed and apologized for everything, kind of like the confession that you heard. Now, obviously, that can't bring Casey or Doug back, but maybe, just maybe, it did give their family some sort of strange peace. In the end, James was found guilty of 11 felony charges, including murder for hire, conspiracy to commit murder for hire, and solicitation to commit murder for hire. And throughout his whole trial, he showed absolutely no remorse. He also wasn't remorseful afterward. 2 of the solicitation charges were for people who ended up not being killed. Meaning that yes, Casey and Doug were not the only people that James tried to have murdered. And thank God those other plots didn't actually work, but because he hadn't actually killed anyone, James and his team felt like it wasn't fair for him to get convicted, even though he had still planned the murders and wanted them done. It's not like you can get away with attempted murder just because the person survived, but for whatever reason, he actually filed an appeal. But ultimately, karma came back at him for his lack of remorse, and it's honestly hilarious. The judge, pretty much in a more professional and fancier term, told him he was already going to die in prison, so what did it matter anyway? And his appeal was denied. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. Doug's family was extremely happy with the outcome and even more happy that everything was finally over.
We're very pleased on how the courts did and how the state did, and the prosecuting attorneys did a phenomenal job, and we're just really happy with everyone and how the outcome came out. It's been really rough. It's been a long haul. We lost our leader, my dad. You know, he was the best man in the world, and it's been really hard to lose your best friend. We've been struggling through it all, but today's justice has been served, and we're really pleased with the outcome.
And the reason I find this so interesting is because it never ceases to amaze me. It's honestly terrifying just how far people will go when money is involved. So I don't know, maybe money truly is the root of all evil. I mean, we have seen it time and time again, whether it's greed, it's over the life insurance policy, it's because you're jealous somebody has more money than you, whatever it is. So was money the root of all evil in this situation? Or was James the root of all evil? And was he just a monster who was looking for an excuse to lash out and kill people and go on this power trip? Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of 10 to Life, and until the next one, please stay safe. Bye.